Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we speak with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations work past the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, we are joined by Luke Redpath, who is an independent Ruby on Rails and iOS app developer. Luke joins us today from the UK. Luke Redpath, welcome to Maintainable.
Thank you for having me.
So as you reflect on your time in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of well-maintained software?
Well, being a freelancer for the last 11 years or so, I've worked on a lot of code bases. So I've seen quite a wide range of quality in those code bases. And over that time, I guess, code that is optimized for readability first for me, I think. I've seen a lot of code that has been a bit too clever for its own good. It feels interesting and clever when you write it, and then you come back to it several months later and you think, what the hell was I thinking when I wrote that code? And I include myself in that. I've written my own fair share of code that I've looked back on and thought, what was I doing? Maintainable software by definition is software you can come back to, and it's easy to change, and it's easy to enhance, add new features, remove old features without breaking everything. So code that's easy to read is really important. You want to be able to bring new developers in and have them jump into a code base and find their way around and understand it as quickly as possible. It goes without saying that tests are important. I think like a lot of Rubyists, testing is really, really important. I'm quite dogmatic about testing. You've got to test, you've got to write unit tests, but not just unit tests. Integration tests and kind of high-level acceptance tests, I think they get forgotten about sometimes because they're slow and they're a pain to write, and they're still important, especially on legacy code where don't necessarily have a lot of unit tests, or it's quite hard to refactor without breaking a lot of unit tests. If you've got that kind of key high-level acceptance test suite in place, it gives you some confidence that you're not going to completely break everything as you try and turn old legacy crufty code into something that's nicer, well-tested code, I suppose. Certainly, when using frameworks like Rails, code that sticks to kind of established conventions wherever possible. I know some people like to go off and do their own kind of thing in the Rails world. People might try and do kind of really heavy domain-driven design, for example, in Rails. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But anything that kind of strays away from Rails conventions automatically introduces a new barrier to entry, I guess, for any Rails developer you might bring onto that project. If they've never done domain-driven design before, then that's another thing they're going to have to learn. But Rails has a lot of conventions for a reason, and if you can stick to them wherever possible, I think that is helpful. That's quite a Rails-focused answer, I suppose, but it can apply to other platforms. I also do mobile development on iOS, which didn't have a lot of conventions, really. Apple kind of pushed the MVC pattern, which tends to break down eventually in any kind of larger sized app. And kind of the iOS community over the last 5 years has gone through this period of discovery of architecture, app architecture. What's the best way of architecting our app? Lots of acronyms, MVVM, MVC, Viper. Some of them are a little bit crazy. Some of them are kind of a better version of MVC. But I think it's a good thing that the community is getting towards some kind of established consensus about good architecture. And I think if you're talking about kind of monolithic Rails apps as well, still, even though they're monoliths, you still want them to be well organized. Being able to break parts of the code up into kind of well-defined modules makes it a lot easier to find your way around, because monolithic Rails apps can get pretty big. I've worked on apps which have had hundreds of models. None of those models are kind of cross-cutting concerns. They could be broken up quite nicely into lots of different modules. So that's another really important thing, I think.
Do you use the term or the metaphor technical debt at all in your...
Yes, all the time.
How do you define that at the moment?
Technical debt to me is any decision made at a given point in time to sacrifice quality in some way to get where you're going faster, knowing that at some point in the future, you're going to have to come back and revisit that decision. I've worked on projects where we've talked about technical debt. It seems like all the time, every week, every sprint meeting, we're talking about technical debt. I think as a metaphor, it works, but people forget the other side of it, which is, debt incurs interest over time. And the longer you leave it, the harder it becomes to repay that interest. I've seen projects where technical debt has just become an excuse to do things badly. It's like, oh, it doesn't matter, it's technical debt, log it in Jira and we'll come back to it. And then that never happens.
We'll get to that someday. Does someday ever exist? Or
Exactly. I mean, there's ways of preventing that, but if they just get lost in a pile of tickets at the bottom of a Jira backlog and the team doesn't make time to tackle those, whether it's setting aside, a certain amount of capacity in every given sprint to tackle it, or, tackling it as you work on a feature, then it just never happens. I think it's okay to sacrifice quality sometimes. There's no point in spending months and months and lots of money developing something that's technically very good if it never launches and you run out of money. So technical debt exists for a good reason. I just think you need to be very considered about when you decide to sacrifice quality.
have you seen, you mentioned like that example where things get thrown into a Jira backlog, and I've talked to different people, on this podcast in particular with different ways and methodologies. You mentioned capacity in terms of like maybe a percentage of time for your team is going to be spent dealing with those types of issues, or what have you seen work well in that space?
I'm quite a fan of I guess it's called the Boy Scout rule. I can't remember who coined that off the top of my head. It might have been Bob Martin. I'm not sure. I'd have to check. But just if for anyone that's not familiar with it, the principle that if you work on a piece of code because you're working on a feature and you encounter something about that code that is not maintainable, it's resistant to change, it's not well tested, it's a bit hacky, then taking the time to fix that while you're working on the feature, whenever possible, is something that you should do. It doesn't always work out. Sometimes what looks like that's a 5-minute fix turns into a massive rabbit hole and you're still down it several days later. I think being able to recognize when you're going down a rabbit hole and stopping is a good thing. I can remember lots of times where I thought, right, I'll just create a new branch. We'll see if we can fix this, merge it back in and carry on. In the end, I've just decided this is a nightmare. This isn't working. I've literally just deleted that branch of code, forgotten all about it, gone back to the team and said, look, we need to tackle this, but it's not a quick fix. This might need a fundamental change somewhere in the system that needs maybe a couple of people to look at it, some proper time scheduled in. But there's a lot of times where you can just make those changes and improve the code as you're working on the feature. You just need to make sure that project owners, for example, understand that when you're working on a feature that you're taking that time to improve the code and it's going to benefit the project in the long run. And that could have been a really simple feature. It could have been someone said, that will only take an hour to implement that feature. And then you've discovered the problem as you start working on it and it turns into a day maybe.
Yeah, that could be definitely a big challenge for teams, especially if they're feeling like under pressure to get something shipped, or if they even gave a small estimate, they're like, oh shit, like now I'm in the scenario where like if I go down and start trying to unweave this rat's nest of code that I thought was like, it seems like a simple enough problem, and now I'm like, well, I said it was only take a couple hours. Now it's like this might take a couple days for me to really make sense of all this, and then being like, oh no, how do I go back and talk to whoever said that let's do this right now, and then like make sure you get buy-in from the team and like, or your stakeholders or the product owner, however you need to navigate that in your team setting. It's a challenge, and then so I think what ends up being a reason why people's like, well, later, I'll have to come back to this later, deal with like, let me get the task at hand right now. Or there's a lot of people coming into the industry where they're new to an application as well, and then they don't have that experience of knowing how to I don't understand that area of code, so might I break it? If there's not, say, a reliable test suite or what have you. So like that can be another reason of people following what their predecessors had been doing within that project, and so maybe getting some repeating bad habits in some sort. So how have you seen people misuse technical debt as a metaphor in conversations with stakeholders?
I think coming back to what I said before about sometimes technical debt just being used as an excuse to not even attempt to do something properly in the first place. Literally an excuse to just hack something together is a way I've seen it sort of be abused, I guess. I think normal technical debt tends to come about more naturally, especially as a code base grows. You encounter decisions you might have made about architecture or the design of the code earlier on that now make it difficult to implement new features. And because you don't have the time to really remodel that part of the code, you tend to kind of work around it. And that's technical debt to me. It's a decision you made earlier that might have been the right decision at the time. And now software changes and so do requirements. The previous decision doesn't fit the new requirements. And because it would take too long to fundamentally change everything just to get that new feature shipped, you make that kind of balanced decision to work around it. And that's technical debt. To me, that's good technical debt. I think picking up a ticket and saying, oh, we could hack this together in a day, or we could spend 3 or 4 days and implement it properly. And the business just saying, oh, could you just do the quick version? Even though we've got the time, we've got the budget to do it properly. And you know as a developer that if you do the quick version, it's going to cost you more time in the future. That's the sort of technical debt I think you want to avoid. There's no need to incur debt if you've got, trying to kind of really stretch this metaphor to its limit now, if you've got the credit, you may as well use it. There's no point in incurring unnecessary debt. But some people will just incur debt because the business kind of is given them the time pressures to ship something out of the door that don't need to be there. There's no real pressing issue to get a feature out of the door in one day when you could spend a couple of days and do it properly.
So given that you've been an independent freelancer for, a little under, say, 12 years or so, you may have said 11 earlier, but I'd love to focus a little bit on a topic that's kind of near and dear to my heart, which is being a guest in another team's code base. And I'm imagining that's been your life for quite a while, I'd imagine. What do you believe are some important things you need to keep in mind when you're diving into a new team's code base?
So this is definitely something I feel like I've learned a lot over the last 10, 11 years. I've learned to be more patient when I become a kind of a new member on a team. It's very easy to pick up a new code base that you don't understand and think, oh, this is crap. Who wrote this code? Knowing full well it could have just been me that wrote that code at some point 3 or 4 years ago. I think it's really important to integrate with the team and understand the context in which decisions were made about the code base over time before just jumping in and criticizing it. It's great to pick up a code base and see lots of opportunities to improve it and refactor it. And quite often that's one of the reasons why you're being brought in by the client. They want you to do that. But it can feel very antagonistic towards the team. Who's this new person? We don't know him. He's coming in, he's criticizing all our code. And it puts people's backs up. Taking the time to kind of understand the app properly, getting to know the domain, which is probably one of the toughest challenges about being a freelancer, I suppose, is rather than spending years and years in one domain and really becoming an expert in it, you need to get up to speed with brand new domains all the time. You need to really understand new businesses. So taking that time to understand the domain, there's almost always been a good reason why a decision was made and why a code base ended up in the way it is. Not always, but frequently there is. So understanding why that happened and hoping that it's documented in some way, whether it's through good commit messages in the source code history, or you have access to the tickets and there's kind of good feedback on that ticket so you can see why it was implemented in that way. But certainly taking your time, being patient, not coming in on day one and saying, right, let's change all this, it's a load of rubbish. No one wants to hear that.
No, and I'm always curious about how, when you join an existing team's project and whether or not the team is excited to have this new person be part of the team or not. And I think there's, sometimes I don't know what's been your experience. I would imagine it's probably been a combination of scenarios where the team's kind of advocated for bringing in someone that's maybe has more experience and more can help level up some aspects of the code or help improve the performance or help optimize some things or help with some refactoring or just be like, we're running way behind on this product launch and we need some help here. Or maybe you're being brought in by someone more senior in the team, or like so someone's manager's bringing in someone else to like, hey, the team's stuck on some stuff. I need some help. I'm assuming, is it a safe assumption you've had kind of a combination of those types of scenarios?
Yes, I think it's probably harder for the more senior developers on a team sometimes to have someone else that's fairly senior coming in. It kind of feels like you're treading on their patch a little bit. Junior developers are always quite enthusiastic and happy to hear someone else's point of view. And I think it's really good to be able to work with junior developers when you come in to a team. Having them, every developer needs to be present when you're kind of making design and technical decisions. And I think it's important to have juniors there to give input. Their input is still valid, even if they don't necessarily have the experience or they're not quite sure. Just having them there, I think, is a really good learning experience for them. And working with junior developers on decisions, sitting down and pairing with them and talking through why you're making decisions, why you're making this technical decision instead of that one. And hopefully trying to lead them to make the same sort of decisions you would make over time, I think is a really good way of mentoring junior developers and including them in the team when you're trying to make these kind of fairly high level decisions about the code structure or how you're going to model something in the domain, for example.
As someone that's, when you're joining these projects and you mentioned like trying to wrap your head around their domain, do you have some strategies you've started to pick up over the years on how to gain some momentum and show some early progress in those relationships?
At a code level, I think it's really good to be able to just dive in and try and ship a PR in your first couple of days on a project. It doesn't have to be the most exciting feature, or it could be a bug fix. But something that touches various parts of the code is good to jump into. In terms of understanding the domain, not necessarily writing any code, I think working closely with the business, talking to product owners, talking to real people in the business that are going to use the software as soon as possible, I think is really important. It's the best way to understand the domain. They know the domain better than anyone else. I've worked on projects sometimes where there's been a layer of business analysts that sit between the development team and the real people that are going to use this software. And sometimes things can get lost in translation. I can think of a lot of times where I've picked up a feature ticket, which has been written by a business analyst, and it can be quite detailed sometimes too detailed. I think that I always like user stories which are they're there to promote, kind of prompt a discussion between you and the business. They're there to get the developer to ask questions and to ask, why do you want to do this? Quite often tickets that end up going through business analysts. I'm gonna sound like I hate business analysts now. I've got nothing against business analysts. I've worked with some really great BAs on projects. But you do quite often end up with quite prescriptive tickets. And when you end up with kind of tickets to prescribe a particular implementation, you're missing that context. You're missing what is the problem they're trying to solve. Is this necessarily the best way of solving it? And it isn't always the best way of solving it. And being able to just sit down with the person that's going to use the product and talk to them and find out what they're really trying to do quite often leads to discovery of new ways of doing things. So having that close contact, even as a freelancer and a contractor as part of the team, is really important, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about, I would imagine that in those scenarios where you've got like a business analyst or tickets that are super detailed, very prescriptive on the implementation, an assumption I would make is that in those environments, they're trying to reduce some of the need for maybe some further conversations. As you're saying, like it's helpful as a developer to want to participate in those conversations, be like, I want to understand why I'm doing this and what's the rationale behind this before we go through and do this, because you want to have more context. And then so sometimes that context gets lost when it's gone through a couple of different layers of different types of people. And then that can be an interesting challenge there, I think, with trying to be like, how do you keep the team like moving forward on pushing shipping stuff is like, it's like a perception that it's more efficient to just give the developers specifically everything they need to do so they can take care of the code, produce the code, ship it back, and we're good, right? Like I don't want to have to like re-explain it to every single person that like that's going to come in contact with this, say, Jira ticket or whatever you're using. It's interesting how that's always a little bit of a challenge in different environments. And because you can also have tickets that are super vague and require a lot of conversations too, and then trying to find a good happy medium there, I think, to some degree. I like that whole point you made about user stories should be able to help, maybe prompt a conversation to further clarify. Are you then more often in a scenario where you feel like you prefer to be in a scenario where you can help update the ticket with some clarity on what the acceptance criteria before you dig into it, and then with the business analyst or whoever's kind of the other side of that ticket?
Yes, I think the kind of ticket grooming process is really important, and I think it's important that developers are involved in it. I think it's fine to write a vague ticket as a starting point. Someone has just an idea that pops into their head. It's great, file it as a ticket in whatever issue tracker you're using, preferably not Jira, but it quite often ends up being Jira. Just make sure they realise it's just a placeholder for a deeper, more meaningful conversation later. And then taking the time to sit down with the client, and it could be a couple of developers, the BA, whoever's going to be involved in developing that ticket out, developing it into the kind of traditional, as a certain type of user, I want to be able to do this. The usual format works well enough. But that last part, the why, that because I want to do this, because what is the reason you want to do this? It's quite often you kind of stop after as a X, I want to do this. And then that's where it finishes. Unless you understand the why, it's very hard to discover what the best implementation is. And I do think whether you're a freelancer or just part of the normal team, being involved in those conversations is really important. If you kind of delegate it off to just the BA who goes away and talks to the customer and comes back with this fully fleshed out ticket, and then the first time the developer sees it is when he picks it up off the top of the backlog queue, that context is gone. And like you said, they then probably will have questions, and then they need to go back, find the product owner and talk to them again. And then the product owner is going to think, well, I've already had this conversation with the BA. Why can't you just go and talk to them? So having involving developers from the outset when you're fleshing out stories and you're kind of grooming the backlog of stories is really important.
If you wouldn't mind, we've talked a little bit about Ruby on Rails, and something that that you're exploring the idea of maybe no longer being part of the freelancing world and trying to find like a full-time employment again in the near future. I wanted to kind of get a little bit of a sense of like, what have you seen has been because I'm hoping that I have a variety of people in the audience that are, some of them might be independent contractors, but I would imagine most people probably are employed somewhere or trying to be employed somewhere. And what have you seen being some of the pros and cons of being an independent contractor?
One of the main pros for me has always been being able to work on a wide variety of projects. For a long time, I didn't enjoy the idea of being kind of stuck on working on the same project or the same app for years and years and years. So that was one motivation, and just having the freedom to work how and where I wanted. And when I started 11 years ago, when I decided to become a freelancer, that was the best way to get that work environment, being able to work remotely, being able to work your own hours, take time off when you want it. And the pay was good, I'll be completely honest. You could earn a lot more money as a freelancer and a contractor. And I have absolutely no regrets becoming a freelancer. It's been able to, enable us to start a family and buy a house, and that's all been great. But it seems like the world of employment has moved on quite a lot in the last decade, and I think you can have a lot of those benefits now in a full-time job. And there's obviously a certain stability to having a full-time job. It's, no job's ever guaranteed, but there is a huge amount of stress that comes with being a freelancer and wondering where the next project is going to come from. Even if you've got, I worked on an 18-month contract last year, which was great on one hand because I knew I had a certain amount of work coming in. But all through that contract, I'm staring at my inbox and thinking, well, where are the leads coming in for the next project? What's going to happen when this comes to an end? I used to get quite a lot of leads 10 years ago, but they really seem to have dried up. And I guess that's partly down to me maybe not going out and getting the leads. I used to blog a lot. Work and family life just got in the way. I used to get a lot of traffic to my website because I blogged, and then that obviously drops off. It's hard work maintaining that constant stream of leads and new work coming in as a freelancer. Having done that for a decade, I kind of feel like I want something a little bit less stressful. And also because I've talked a lot about being kind of on the team, when I come into a new team, having that kind of senior, high-level consultant level role, where I take a lot more of an interest in solving the business problems, leading teams, mentoring junior developers. So it kind of feels like now is a good time to me to move into more of a tech lead role somewhere. And I feel like that would be best achieved going and working for, one person, one company, rather than moving to and from different projects over and over again as well.
We'll be back with our interview with Luke in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I want to take a quick moment to say, first, thank you for listening to Maintainable. And second, I wanted to take a moment to plug my own company. So as you may know, I am the CEO of Planet Argon. We're a software consultancy based in Portland, Oregon, United States that helps companies with existing Ruby on Rails applications, primarily, make them better and more maintainable. What does this mean? So a lot of our clients come to us with existing Rails apps, and they might be needing to get help with an upgrade, and we might be able to help coach their team on how to do that themselves. Or perhaps they're just running behind on their backlog and they need some help on building out some new features. Or more often is that they come to us and their app's beginning to show some age and they need help with improving the performance of the application. They need help with just cleaning up some technical debt, maybe rethinking some of the architecture and working on refactoring projects. We love digging our hands into those types of dirty problems, rolling up our sleeves and helping clean that up. So if you're curious, get in touch with us at planetargon.com. And now, back to our interview with Luke Redpath. I haven't been a freelancer necessarily in a really long time. I did that for a few years before, and then I became an agency. So I have some of those similar concerns about like, what are the next projects? It's always like, we're really busy right now for the next couple of months, but 3 to 6 months, I was in a conversation, like a personal conversation with some friends last night, and they're like, how's business? I'm like, well, we've been really consistently busy so far this year, but in 6 months, I don't know, this is all going to fall apart if I don't figure out where the next leads are going to come from, right? And that's why then I get like that, and like I have that issue with like, then I've got like a dozen employees or whatever, and it's like, oh, I got to keep everybody employed, and it's like sometimes I fantasize about the idea. I'm like, what if I just got a job again? Someone else's budget to worry about, and they're responsible for the sales and marketing and stuff like that as well. But I think that I'm also, you mentioned earlier also that your life situation has changed over since say a decade ago, and you have other stresses in your life and want that stability, and that's interesting. I think there's always I don't know that freelancing is for everybody and for forever either, and it doesn't need to be a forever thing either. And I think I've seen people struggle with they have a certain amount of pride with like the fact that they've been able to do things a certain way. Like, look, I'm self-employed for this long, and like it's part of their identity. And then be like, well, if I go get a job again, am I somehow going to be perceived by myself? I might look at myself like, I don't know. Have you navigated some of those internal monologue, like conversations with yourself? And I'm asking you to be a little vulnerable here. I appreciate, but I'm always curious about that type of stuff, because I want the audience to hear this stuff, because I don't think it's uncommon.
It's something I've thought about more and more over the last couple of years. There's been a few occasions where I thought maybe I should, finish being a freelancer, get a full-time job. And then, a really lucrative contract comes up. It's a year of work. It's a good rate. And you think, oh, well, I'm safe and secure again for another year. I'll take that. And then you forget about it for a while. But obviously this year has been an unusual year for everybody. And it's got me thinking about it again. And also I kind of feel like I'm maybe coming up to a halfway point in my career. I mean, I've been freelancing for 11 years, but I've been doing web development or web design or something along those lines for almost 20 years now. I'm starting to think, what does the next 20 years of my career look like? And it kind of feels like depending on your ambition, there's a limit to how far you can go as a freelancer and a contractor. I mean, your rates can go up over time as you get more experience, but there's always going to be a ceiling to what you can charge. But there's not really anywhere for your career to go, I suppose. You're either just a consultant or a contractor and you come in and you work on a project and then you go off again. Whereas something I see a lot of people talking about going into either kind of a tech lead role or an engineering management role. And it seems if you're in the kind of full-time employment world, there is a career progression there. And I see more and more companies talking about career progression frameworks, and it feels like something the industry is really thinking about a lot more these days than what they were doing, say, 10 years ago. I thought a lot about what kind of direction I want to go. I always feel like I want to do some hands-on coding, but I don't feel like I want to be a bum-on-seat programmer, as it were, for the next 20 years of my career. Nothing against anyone who just wants to program for the rest of their career and then retire when they're done. It's just not for me. I feel like I want to move more in that kind of tech lead direction. It feels like a good balance of having that high level leadership role, but still maintaining a bit of hands-on programming, even if it's half the amount of programming I might do now. But it is certainly something I've spent more and more thinking about over the last couple of years. And and with everything that's been going on this year, work slowing down even more, it feels like now is a good time to make that leap, I suppose.
Can appreciate that. Yeah, thanks for opening up and sharing a bit about that. I'm always curious about that type of conversation and topic related to just navigating those types of changes in your career and stuff like that. Yeah, I say that because even openly, like sometimes I have to question my own, like, am I just doing what I'm doing because I've been doing it so long and it's like my identity now? Or is this like, how do I think about my career in the next, 15, 20 plus years or whatever? Because I've been in the industry about the same amount of time as you. And so that's there is this kind of like, am I making the same sort of impact, or how can I make more impact maybe? And I think that's when you talk about some of those like tech lead roles or engineering manager type roles, there is a level of like, I can make more impact than just what my fingers can type into a code editor, right? And so that can help enable other people to move up in their career. Be the engineering manager that I wish that I had, early in my career or something could be a way to look at that as well. I wanted to touch on another thing related to Ruby on Rails, because just more of this is actually kind of like one of the questions I use in some of my interviews when I'm interviewing potential people that work for me at my company. So specific to Rails. And so I'm not trying to catch you off guard or anything too much here, but a little hypothetical scenario that I run by people. And I think I'm always curious to hear people's answers here. So let's say I'm going to give you access to a Git repository to say a monolithic Ruby on Rails application, and you're not going to be able to clone the project and get it up and running in your local dev environment, but you're going to be able to click around in GitHub or whatever and see the code in your browser, and I'm going to say, okay, in 2 hours, can you send me over an email or something, that write up that explains what you believe the application offers its end users and why some company might have paid to have this be built? How would you approach that?
That's a really good question. I do that quite a lot. I quite like reading code on GitHub, even my own code. If I've opened a pull request, I'll quite often come back to it several times and just read the pull request again and make sure it makes sense. But then actually just diving into source code repositories and reading them, I think is a really good way of learning. And I guess my starting point in a Rails application would be the routes file, I think, just to give me a high level overview of, what does this app expose? Does it have an API? Does it have an admin section? What can you do in the admin section? What can you do with the API? What does the front end look like? And then based on what I learned from the routes file, I would probably look at the models and then move quite quickly over to the test folder, I think. I'd stay away from the views. I don't think there's much to not much to learn from looking for views and HTML templates, not to start with. Controllers tend to be pretty boring in Rails. I mean, they should be boring. Good controllers in Rails should be pretty boring. But I'd dive into the test folder and I'd hope there's some acceptance tests in there. and I'd try and find those, and I would read through those. If there aren't any acceptance tests, then I would start looking through the model tests, and just try to get a feeling for what the app does. I'd also look through the commit history as well. I'd try and find interesting commit messages, and the pull request history as well, I think is a good way of seeing how the app has developed over time. Hopefully, by having done all that, you should have a good handle on what the app does at the very least. In an ideal world, it'd have a really good README as well. Just explaining what the app does, how to get it up and running, maybe some screenshots. Screenshots are really useful, actually. I think more pull requests should have screenshots. I've worked on a few projects where every time you open a pull request, we use a template that says, drop a few screenshots in here. I've seen some developers even go further and record little videos and attach them as GIFs if it's got some kind of interactive front-end feature. And clients love that as well. They love to be able to just click on a pull request and see what it does. They might not understand the code side of it, but if they can see pictures of what's about to hit master and the next deployment to staging, they like to see all of that. And it's useful for other developers to keep on top of what other people are working on as well.
I think that idea with screenshots or little screen recordings is super helpful, especially with depending on the size of a client you're working with. But I'm always encouraging my team to I'm like, did you include screenshots? Don't make people think too much if they don't have to, in terms of if you can show hey, I went and tested this in this, especially if you're working on a bug fix or something, you're like, oh, look, see now I click, I'm demonstrating that I want to reproduce the bug. I can see it. And then also see now it's working. Here's a quick little video. It can cut down on some of the back and forth of them reviewing and testing. Okay, cool. Just ship it to production and we're good. Cause you've shown that, you've solved the problem. And so you can save them some time of going in to a staging environment and logging in and going to that thing, trying to click through around. If you could save them 5-10 minutes of their activity by providing a 20-second video, that's everybody's better off for that. And then that tends to not be as expensive and laborious of a task to do either, just to create those things really quickly and one-off. So I think people think that I don't know how to create a video. That sounds complicated, but once you find some good tools for that, it's actually pretty quick. So that's some good suggestions. But yeah, thanks for running through that exercise for me. Yeah, you pass. I think you might actually know what you're talking about when it comes to Rails. It's interesting because I'll ask people that and get wildly different answers sometimes. And it's always I am looking as an employer to hear if they're going to be looking at look for tests. If they don't even mention the test folders, spec folders, whatever, and look to see if there's anything that kind of helps convey how the application should be working. I usually see that as a little bit of a flag and be like, okay, well, maybe they have some notion of how to work on tests, but that is something I'm looking to hear people kind of mention. And there's a lot of different ways, and you also hear about people well, look at the views and see what they're asking for in forms. And you can you can make some sense of from a schema file sometimes is helpful. Rails is pretty good at naming. Hopefully people are good at naming things. So you kind of get a sense okay, well, what's an order? Well, an order for what, there's items and okay, there's a cart. Okay, that makes sense. There's might be some e-commerce functionality here, but a couple of quick last questions before we wrap up. Do you find yourself more often on team refactor or team rewrite?
Team refactor, I think. There are times where it feels like a rewrite is the only solution, but it's an expensive process to go through. I very rarely encounter a code base that is so bad that it's a lost cause. What would push me towards a rewrite, I guess, would be code that is fairly bad in the first place to warrant it, has no test coverage whatsoever, not even acceptance tests, is becoming harder and harder to change. Simple features are taking 2 or 3 times as long as they should take. But I would always try and push for the refactoring solution first. I mean, lots of code bases are salvageable. You can add acceptance tests to any code base, no matter how bad they are. You can fire up some Selenium tests and run through as many scenarios as possible. Nobody likes doing it. Nobody likes writing acceptance tests, especially after the fact, going back and writing all these tests for every feature that's ever been implemented. But that could be the difference between having to throw a code base away and being able to kind of whip it into shape.
I think it can be a challenge sometimes even without that test suite to really know what does a rewrite even look like if you don't know exactly how it's supposed to work. if you don't have that all in your head or documented pretty cleanly, you kind of still have end up with a similar type of challenge.
Yeah.
So
I can give an example of I was on team rewrite, or the client was on team rewrite, and I agreed with them. A client I worked for about 9 years ago now, they were developing a system for kind of telematics-based insurance. So they captured driving data from a device in your car, and then that data got uploaded to their server, and then they would process it to build up a driver's profile, and then they could use that. They could send that to an insurer, and they could tailor an insurance quote for you based on how good a driver you were. When I came on board, the system was a couple of C++ apps, which did some really kind of... It was written in C++ for the performance reasons. It basically took all your GPS coordinates and snapped them to roads, and it was quite an intensive process. But the glue that held everything together was a Perl script, thousands of lines long. And obviously that was not maintainable. And where do you even begin to start refactoring something like that? My task was to take that file and rewrite it in Ruby and Ruby on Rails as well for kind of the back end. It was a challenge. I'd never read or written any Perl in my life. I mean, if you're a Rubyist, it's not hard to read Perl. You can see some of the influences on Ruby from Perl there. But it was quite enjoyable in the end to be able to take this massive Perl script, which had got them to where they needed to be at that point in the business. They'd got their working prototype. We developed a domain model out of it. We broke it up into kind of little individual jobs that we tied together with, I think we used Rescue at the time, just to form the little pipeline. And that became the starting point for their system going forward. And that system, they were able to maintain and develop over time. And then when I came back to work for them 6 years later, I came back to do some iOS work for them by that point. And the company had grown from 3 people to 50 plus employees. It was still running Rails for a lot of the back end stuff. The pipeline was still there. It probably developed and changed a lot since I first wrote it. But that, I think, is a good example where a rewrite paid off. That Perl script was never going to be maintainable. It was never going to scale. But it got them to where they needed to be. It was a quick prototype, and the rewrite made sense.
Thanks for sharing that example there. You mentioned you're also doing iOS development, and there's been more conversations about having maybe more consistent patterns for how to build those applications, and knowing that one of the benefits of things like Ruby on Rails for us early on was that we could jump between projects, as contractors, and freelancers, whatever, to as long as they followed most conventions, we can kind of navigate our way around. And that was a really good thing, because prior to that, it was a lot of my own experience was I worked in PHP prior to working with Ruby on Rails as the primary language. I used some other languages before that, but it was always all right, well, how is this thing pieced together? Are they using maybe some different templating things here, but how are they talking to the database? It felt like it was the preference of whatever developer at that time decided to use. And something like Ruby on Rails is this does not have those conversations. Let's just jump forward a couple and be here's some baseline that we're all kind of agreeing to. Either you're embracing it, or you're going to be fighting a different type of battle. And so are you seeing that that's improving in the mobile development world with these other frameworks? There are some more patterns there?
Definitely. It kind of almost feels like a process, a community that evolves around a language or a framework has to go through at some point. And I feel like Rails went through it as well. Even though Rails came with all of these conventions, and it was almost revolutionary. Like you say, I was also a PHP programmer before I picked up Ruby, and there was no convention there. Then Ruby on Rails came along, and all of a sudden, every language had its Rails framework. Python had Django, and PHP had, I think, Symfony and various others kind of growing over time. And it almost feels like every new web framework looks a little bit like Rails in some way. So it's been quite influential. But I remember Rails going through a process of everyone having lots of logic in the controllers. And then everyone said, no, you shouldn't do that. It's got to be thin controllers, fat models. That was kind of the first evolution that I remember. And then people started realizing, well, now our models are just bloated and we've got 1,000-line user classes. And so then the next evolution was, let's stick it all in services. Let's have a service layer. And then you ended up with this services folder full of files, which are they commands? Are they services? What do they really do? Is it just almost a junk drawer? And I think the Rails went through that process of the community saying, what is the best way to structure your code within the framework that Rails gives you. And I've very much seen the iOS community going through that as well, particularly over the last 5 years since Swift came along, but before that as well. And we've had kind of very minimal changes from MVC, really crazy architectures where one feature requires about 6 different classes to implement. I think that might be some Java programmers sneaking into the iOS development community. But I think a lot of Rubyists also went on to pick up iOS and try to bring some of the knowledge they learned from Rails as well and trying to structure iOS apps. And just the fact that they had the conversation about architecture, I think is a good thing. It always takes some time for the community to decide what's the best way of doing it. And from what I see, everything seems to be heading towards the idea of unidirectional data flow. Things like being influenced by things like React and Redux and Vue.js and Vuex. Your user interface is a function of your state. And I'm seeing that the iOS community seems to be picking up on that idea now. And I think Apple were almost pushing people that way with having a reactive framework like Combine out of the box. I mean, there's been RX Swift and various reactive frameworks for Objective-C and Swift for years, but now Apple have their own. It's almost like they're giving it this style of programming their blessing. And of course, Swift UI, which the whole concept of it is this reactive user interface that just refreshes as your state changes. So I feel finally the iOS community is coming together around this idea, which is great. It makes it a lot easier for JavaScript programmers who have been doing React for years to jump into iOS and pick it up because it's all the same kind of idea, really. You have some state, it changes, your user interface updates. And it's a very different style of programming an application that you might do in Rails because you've got the whole client-server thing that you don't need to worry about with iOS. But I think all these communities go through this process all the time.
So as you reflect on your time in the industry, I know that there's a lot more tooling available. There's a lot, every application, the pipeline to me feels more complicated in a lot of ways. There's a lot of more technologies you need to know how to ship something and deploy something. Do you feel like that's creating a barrier at all for people coming into the industry to be able to get up and running quickly because they have to understand a lot, or compared to what I feel like we might have needed to know 15, 20 years ago?
I think maybe there is. I mean, you said there's a lot of tooling. There really is a lot of tooling these days compared to even 5 years ago, certainly compared to 10 years ago. When Rails first came out, it was fairly straightforward. You did gem install Rails, you generated a new Rails project and off you go. You edit your database.yaml and you're good to go. And these days, as well as doing all of that, you've got to worry about Node and NPM and Yarn and what JavaScript frameworks you're going to use, what CSS libraries you're going to use. It just feels like there's a lot of tools these days, and it's hard to know whether that is a barrier for brand new developers because they're young and enthusiastic and they want to learn everything. Whereas I'm only 37, but I feel like I'm getting on in the industry now. I'm old in the industry, and I can only keep up with so many technologies, especially when I'm jumping back and forth between the iOS world and the Rails world. The evolution of JavaScript over the last 5 years almost feels like it passed me by. I mean, I have got one eye on it. I know what React is. I know what Next.js is. I know what Vue is. But I've never really written any of that stuff because the sort of Rails apps I work on just don't use any of that. But I can see how it could be intimidating. I wonder if I was a new developer now, whether I would find that a problem. It's hard to say.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of like I don't know what it's like. And, I employ junior developers for their first job in this field. And they usually come out of like a boot camp or something for 6 months or whatever. And they know a lot more than I give them credit for, I think they would. But then there's a lot of like concepts. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. But then I also realize that there's a lot of fundamental concepts that I learned early on that maybe don't even need to be explained in the same way. necessarily, because they're thinking things at a different level than needing to worry about how to debug things because there might be some DNS issues or something, and like they're like, oh, how does DNS work? And I'm like, oh, but I can tell you all about that, because that was like some of my early era of my career was managing DNS servers like manually on Linux machines or something. But so there's all these different like technology stacks, and so sometimes I worry that I'm thinking that things are more complicated now, but I used to need to know way more low level things in some ways back then that I don't know that people need to know as much anymore. So I don't know, maybe it's not that different. It's just different technology stacks. There's more that I don't know about, and that makes me feel intimidated in the industry as well. I'm like, I haven't written in any React. I made a few updates to some React apps, but I honestly didn't know what the hell I was doing in it. So it's confusing to me. So I'm not part of that world. But
I was just going, we both started writing Rails apps where the state of the art was kind of Scriptaculous and Miraculous and all of those kind of libraries. And we were still using jQuery, and jQuery was bundled with Rails, and it was simple. I like Stimulus.js. I think it's a great way of progressively enhancing Rails apps with JavaScript. It works for me. I've never felt the need to start throwing myself into learning things like React. And there's a lot of great JavaScript front-end developers out there that specialize in that kind of thing. And to be completely honest, it's never really been massively of interest to me. So I've just kind of left it alone, really.
Well, with that, as we wrap things up, where can listeners best follow your thoughts on software development online?
Twitter is probably the best place. I keep telling myself I need to start blogging again, and I really do hope to start blogging again. But in the meantime, Twitter is probably the best place to follow my thoughts on the latest software developments and controversies, I guess.
Excellent. Well, it's been such a delight having you on Maintainable, Luke. Thanks so much for talking shop.
Thanks for having me.
Maintainable.